Nearly 80 years ago, the world was in conflict. We are joining those who lived through it to learn more about that time and how people were affected by the war. We may forget, but they remember.
Servicemen and women, they had to be served first. But things were rationed. I remember that we had to be careful how much we took of this or that.
Gasoline was rationed. You were only allotted so many gallons of gasoline a month. You were allotted only so much meat that you could buy at the store. Some of the groceries, bread you were allotted so many loaves of bread at that time.
Butter was rationed, but they came out with a substitute, oleomargarine, but it was white and it didn't look like butter, and so they put in a little yellow pill. When you bought it, then you would break open that pill and then you would knead the oleomargarine, so it looked like butter, but it never did taste like it. But you got used to it.
The sugar was rationed, shoes were rationed, tires were rationed, gasoline was rationed. You had books of ration tickets. And when you go someplace to buy something, you'd have to tear out a ration ticket to get it.
You get a stamp or something, and if you wanted to buy sugar, now that would be one of the things that we wouldn't grow on the farm. You'd go to the store and put out your ration or your kind of a stamp, and you could buy sugar until I guess you ran out of them.
A lot of the cars were not being made at that time. If you had a car, you were very fortunate because they were not making cars. Everything was used to make airplanes and tanks. Not too far from where we live over in Kansas City, Kansas, they were making B-24 bombers at the Chevrolet plant.
Well, we had one car. So we were a farm family with one car, and I do remember a time when we couldn't get rubber tires to get on them, and so the car was basically parked in the garage and it had to stay there for a certain amount of time until we could get new tires to put on it.
They had speed limits set, national speed limits, 45 miles an hour as fast as you could come.
They had notified him that his time, how far he could drive with his trucks were restricted. And here they were giving him 6,100 miles a year that he could drive on his car with his truck. In those days that probably wasn't too restrictive, but except that he used his trucks for going out and picking up old wrecked trucks and cars and things, and he would sell scrap metal during the war to make a living.
Now remember, tires were hard to get. Each car was located 5 tires, and he wanted you to conserve that. And Dad had a tractor on steel wheels that time. He wanted so much to get rubber tires for the tractor, which consisted of taking the steel wheels off, putting on steel rims, and putting a rubber tire on that. So he had to go sign up for that at the OPA Office of Price Administration. And finally he was able to get 2 front tires and finally 2 back tires for his tractor. But that took, I don't know, probably 6 months to do. But you could get some if you're a farmer. But other people had to wait longer because farmers were the producers of the products and everything, the food.
It was all for the benefit of those who were fighting the war.
Rationing wasn't the only change happening during the war. Citizens had to adapt by becoming resourceful.
Butcher a hog and a calf, and the neighbors would come in and help us, especially during the war. And they would come in, and Dad would get the hog or calf up in a tree on actually it was a fence post tightener to hoist it up with, and they would come in carving out the beef and everything, and then they would take the meat, Mom would take the meat and then eat it canned what meat we had there, and can, of course, they always pressure cookered everything and had lids on, so that made it bacteria free, and use that in the wintertime too. And then the excess fat on the hogs we would put in a big kettle and heat it up, and then render what we call the fat, which came out to be lard at that time, and we put lard in buckets and everything and save that for use during the winter.
My dad would always go fishing and bring fish home, and we'd have fish and things of that nature.
Farming that we did was workhorses, and they were basically utilized by us, and we were probably some of the last people to use horses.
Those days, people had gardens, and we had an apple tree and a peach tree. We had 3 rows of raspberries, and this was the girls' our job to do. And because we did not like to do it, the 3 of us would sing then. We'd harmonize, and the neighbors always knew when we were picking berries.
My younger sister and me, and we would pick about 45 bushels of okra every Monday, every Wednesday, and every Friday. Of course, that was our livelihood.
And remembering that I'm nine years old, I went to work at 9 years old in the summertime, hoeing beans for a canning factory. And I got to go out there you send any corner that you wanted to, and they had a school bus that the company used to pick up anybody who wanted to work in the fields. They just pick around, and they get on the bus, they give you a hoe, and you took your lunch with you, and they take you out to the field and put you out. And they had a noon break to eat your lunch, and then another 4 hours to finish the day. And I earned $1.25 a day, not an hour, a day for that. And it was pretty hard work for a 9-year-old kid to hold these big fields. And you do, okay, you start here and look down the end. Yeah, I got the hole. Anyway, it was hard work for me.
You know, he sowed some corn and sowed some wheat and oats as he produced it. You know, got some money.
Always ate really well. I don't know of any of the friends, because most of us in our community had gardens. I think that was just par for the course during that period, because the Depression, came into, and so gardens were a necessity to survive. But we always had good dinners. My dad and mom, they were together planting that garden. What my mother liked, what she thought we would eat, but he almost had every vegetable you could think of that we liked. And he just treated that garden, it just grew beautifully.
Our area was pretty plentiful in terms of honey, and I think it was relatively cheap as to what else you would have to spend for sweeteners. And so to have honey cookies or something like that was not unusual. It was probably more of the normal in our area.
There was several black markets going around. I remember, I've heard of them. You could buy sugar in a black market, but that was illegal trade, kind of behind the scene trade. But one couple bought 5 pounds of sugar, supposedly. It was flour when they got home to open up. So there's things like that going on.
My dad was pretty good at fixing shoes. He could do what we called half-soled shoes. So you could buy leather in really old big sheets, and then you could cut them out, and then he could put them on your shoes if you needed them. You'd use tacks, shoe tacks, and also glue quite a bit to glue them on. Anyway, people learned to do quite a few things that they don't have to do now or never think about doing.
We only wore shoes during the winter time. We always went barefooted during the summer. like April, we started going barefoot in April or so, May, and started wearing shoes again when we had to go to school in September.
Okay.
And of course, from spring to fall, sometimes you had grown out of your old shoes, but I always, since I was the youngest of the boys, I always knew what pair of shoes I would have next. But you wear off your heels, right? And in order to get more life out of the shoe, we would take the heel off and turn it around, cut the corners off that were sticking out, so that we have the heel that was not worn off as much still to wear afterwards. But we couldn't do that with the soles. Our soles were so thin after a while, you know, that you could feel every rock underneath. You could hardly walk anymore in them. They didn't protect you in the winter time. There's, you know, your feet could, a little protection, but not much.
But if you had if you got a flat tire, which was quite normal because people didn't have new tires, that they buy brand new tires every 3 or 4 years and don't worry about it. But the tires were rubber. See, nowadays they have vinyl. They make tires out of it. But anyway, because the rubber was all needed for the war effort. See, so if you on the highway, if you had a flat tire, you'd pull over and you stop, then you get out the jack out of the car, jack the car up, you take the tire off, then you have to remove the one side of the tire itself from the rim, reach in and pull the inner tube out. They had inner tubes then. Today they don't have inner tubes in the tires. And then you would take, and we had a little patch kit, little round box. You'd take that open, and you'd repair that hole in the tire and put a patch on it. Then you let it dry 10-15 minutes. Then you put it back in the tire, take your tire iron and work the tire back around the rim. Here's a snap, get it in there tight. Then you'd have a little pump you'd pump the tire up with. You couldn't get enough air, but you get enough to get to the next station, the next town in those days. And it wasn't you just had to do that because that's all you had to if you want to keep going.
Yeah.
That's just the way they did.
My mother was a very religious person, and she expected me to toe the line. But she gave me a quarter one day to go get a haircut. Now, this was a lot of farmers around the town, and so on Saturday they'd come in and get their haircut. Well, they'd come in, I'd go into the barber shop early, and I'd be sitting there waiting for a haircut, and the farmer would come in and say, "Young man, are you waiting for a haircut?" "Yes, sir." "Well, let me have you and I'll pay your haircut." And I used to make pretty good money sitting there reading comic books waiting for the next. Then I'd take the money that I acquired, and I'd go to the movies and get popcorn, the same day.
We were going to build this swimming pool, swim pool. We dug a hole and filled it with water and jumped in. Of course it gets muddy, right? But we didn't want anybody to fill in the hole. So when we had to go upstairs to go to bed at night, we covered this little hole with some boards and put dirt on it and leaves so it wasn't visible.
Whether it be small or large, many sacrificed by serving others.
Dutch members of the church, they sent a wagon full, a truck full of potatoes in the fall of 1945, and also herring in barrels, which was very generous, really. The Dutch were occupied by the Nazis, by the Nazi army, and the members of the church were brothers and sisters. And the people, the leaders, the church leaders in the district of Berlin decided to save some of those potatoes to use as seed potatoes in the next spring. And somebody secured about an acre of land or 2 acres of land where these seed potatoes were planted. And then for fear that people might come and dig up the potatoes, you know, because everybody was hungry all the time, we had to pull guard duty. And during the daytime, from about 7 in the morning till dark, it was women and children, sisters, Relief Society sisters with their kids, with the guards. And in the evening, boys 14 and older and their dads would come and be the guards in the evening, all night. And then, so my mother and us younger children were there at least 3 times, as I remember, guarding. Then my older 2 brothers and my dad did guard duty at night, and they were there at night, and you know, had fires going and so on. And the next day, my dad had to go to work. The church started sending, you know, desert industry foods, you know, canned peaches, cracked wheat, and so on. And my dad was a branch president at that time, and he divided it out to all the members equally. There were some active members that were complaining that my dad was including in the food less active members. And my dad was very, said, well, don't they get hungry? Don't they need the food? Yes. Okay. I don't want to hear about this again. He got his pay in an envelope, but the Eastern currency was not worth much as far as it was concerned. But he'd bring it home, he'd empty it out, the full change. He would pay tithing, you know, fill out the tithing slip, and he always had it given to him in such a way that he could pay the tithing out of it without having to go change the bills and so on. And so he was teaching us every month. He was teaching us about paying tithing.
We saw them when they were going into, men especially, going into the service and leaving their families, which was a great sacrifice at that time during the war. Young men especially.
All of the young men, instead of being in school and other places, school being educated and stuff like that, were in the war effort.
My brother was in college at the time, but he graduated soon after, and he went in the Air Force. And of course we were very, very proud of him. But he was killed in 1942. He was a pilot, and he was a pilot of, they called them the Flying Tigers.
My cousin Rex was the first one from Albany to be killed during the war. And the man that was taking the telegraph about his being killed didn't want to take it out up in the country to my aunt and uncle, and he went. I think the whole family couldn't believe this. He took the telegraph to Rex's brother that was a sophomore in high school, and he had to take it home to his parents on the bus. I mean, that was so traumatic for him.
Communities were trying to support the war any way they could.
You know, just kids collecting scrap metal and everything we could collect. They had a big disposable unit not too far from us where we put all these items that we collected, metal items, and even the gum wrappers, which had tinfoil, we saved those and rolled them up and put them there. And anything that we could find that would help. They had a huge picture of Adolf Hitler, a statue kinda, and we would try to get that all covered up with items for the war.
In that time, you'd get toothpaste if you bought toothpaste. I think a lot of us used soda and mix soda and salt together and use that to brush your teeth. But if you bought toothpaste, it came in tubes, and these tubes were metal. very thin metal, but so wasn't unusual for families to save their toothpaste tubes.
We saved aluminum. That was some, I don't know, they made airplanes out of it or something. But you'd roll it up in a ball, and when you'd get a ball about that big, you would turn it in.
Mother would save the grease from anything that bacon or whatever you were fixing, because they used that for ammunition, I guess. They turned it in.
But in high school, they had study hour, and at study hour, they knitted socks for the Army. And I know my mother made clothes for the Army people.
I guess they used milkweeds to make life preservers for people that were going to be in the Navy or near water or something like that. And so I remember sort of when I was, I guess, just to the end of the war, that we went out and gathered milkweeds. So we'd gather them and we'd put them in a little bag, and the bags were worth so much, I don't remember how much. But anyway, the military, or somebody used them to make life preservers.
Milkweed pods were collected for manufacture of parachutes during that time, so we collected milkweed pods and took them in.
They sold war bonds, then they called them victory bonds, and then they called them savings bonds. But you could pay $18.75, and then after 10 years you'd get $25. That interest was earned. And so people were buying those as gifts for each other and all. And then you could also buy a 10-cent stamp, and you could get, if you bought 100 of those, then you'd have a $10 bond that you could turn in later on for, I don't know, $15 or something.
We could buy stamps. They had defense stamps at that time, and you could turn them into a bond. If you got $18.75 worth of stamps, you could collect a bond. And we did that at school. They would sell the stamps for a dime, and we'd buy stamps and try to fill up our stamp book to help with the war.
For America, the war was started in Pearl Harbor. These memories are almost as vivid today as they were then.
I was 9 years old when Pearl Harbor was born. And at the time, it was, I didn't even know where it was or what it meant, Pearl Harbor. I knew it had to be some water, but I didn't have any knowledge of it.
Cable heater on the radio, and he was the one that announced about the Japanese bombing the ships in Hawaii. And I remember my mother started crying because she knew that meant World War. And so, I mean, I really, really remember that. I was only 8 years old then.
I remember the Sunday afternoon when I was sitting on my dad's lap and we were reading the paper, funny papers. They used to have funny papers then, which were really good. And it came over the radio that the Japanese had just bombed Pearl Harbor. And that was a real challenging thing at that time. And of course I told you I was 7 years old. I would have been 7 in December. I was actually 6 when that actually took place.
I was upstairs in my bedroom, and I heard newsboys running up and down the street shouting something. And eventually I heard them say bombed, and that what they were saying was Pearl Harbor had been bombed. I don't remember, I stayed up in my room. I don't remember if my father went out and got a paper. I would think he did, but I don't remember that. I remember my mother going into her bedroom. I figured she was going in to cry. My father was in the National Guard, and I figured he was off to war the next day. But then, yeah, they declared war.
What was it like to serve in the war?
and several family members had to leave to go to the military. So that was because when they drafted people, you could also enlist if you wanted to, but a lot of people just waited for the draft general to take them and draft them into the Army, I guess. If you didn't want to go in the Army, then you could enlist in the Navy or Marines, or didn't have Air Corps there, and Air Force didn't become about till about 1948. It was the Army and the Army Air Force was together, and then in 1948 they split that off.
I guess my wife was home and sacrificed leaving her.
You had a tail gun.
Navigator and bombardier down in the nose. And co-pilot up above. And a waist gunner and a waist gunner and a ball turret gunner and then a tail gunner back. He had 250 calibers back in the tail. He'd go like that and this way. He wouldn't go down very far. But I got down in there and I made it all right. Claustrophobia. It wasn't bothering me. Didn't bother me. But I had the parachute on. The parachute up that thick. And if I wanted to bail out here, I reached up there and opened two latches and the door dropped down and you go down. Bailed out.
You never did have to bail out though, right?
No. I'm glad I didn't too.
What bomb group were you in?
91st Bomb Group.
91st Bomb Group?
322nd Bomb Squadron. There's 4 squadrons. And I was in the 322nd. And we were bombing in the daytime. And we got in on that first daylight raid on Berlin. And it was rough. We got 2 engines shot out. We had to throw our guns out. We pulled our 50 caliber guns out of the airplane, threw them out to lighten the load so we get back to England. And you imagine being down there in a 50 caliber going through your roof. But we threw all of our guns out, but we made it back to England. I saw a lot of airplanes go down. Smoke far out the back. And, pretty rough. Seen them go down. The Germans were attacking our formation. Believe me, they flew right through. We had an upper echelon and they flew right through the formations, but they never hit us. They never hit us, but if they'd have done like that, they might have got us. 30 missions, and I'm still here. Thank the Lord.
It was especially hard in Germany, where the war was going on all around you.
My earliest memories of World War II are air raids. I was about 2.5, 3 years old at that time. We lived near a plant that supplied utilities to a number of hospitals in the area that were built by the city of Berlin, and the plant was the city of Berlin plant. My father was responsible for the production of electricity via a steam turbine. And so you had a big boiler room with many boilers and people that had to keep the fires going. And the steam from those boilers drove the turbine. It also provided central heating to these hospitals and electricity to these hospitals. There were about 20 buildings altogether, 5 different hospitals. And so when this plant was always a target of some sort, even though the hospitals during World War II had to have a big, white field with a red cross on it so that that the enemies wouldn't bomb those. They were supposed to be hospitals. But actually the people in the plant were were lucky, they were never hit. Bombs always were blown off to some farmers' fields. But so at night, in order to be prepared to leave and go into the air shelter, we either went to the one in the building, in the apartment building that we were living in, or if it looked like we had time, we could go over to the plant where my dad was, because he always had to be on duty doing those raids. Anyway, so we learned early. We had a piano in our living room, and when we went to bed at night, we put our clothing down in the order in which we would put it on, you know, if we had to go in the bomb shelter. So my mother would wake us up. If we didn't wake up ourselves, we'd troop into the living room, get our clothing on. My mother would take care of my little sister. She was just a year old, a year and a half at that time. And then my assignment was to get the eating utensils from the kitchen drawer, and I put those in a bag, and then when I was ready, I took it, stood by the door and waited for my brothers to get finished, and they had to, each one had an assignment to take something that they had to take, and my mother then, when she was finished getting my little sister ready and herself ready, then we went down 3 flights of stairs into our basement if there wasn't time enough to go across the street to the plant. And my dad, I remember seeing my dad calling up to the train man there, says, "Are you going into Berlin, you know, to the city center?" And he said, "Yes, come on, we'll wait for you." So we scrambled up, and the doors just closed, and then we heard air raid signal, you know, the sirens for air raid. So we all had to scramble out of the train and down into the area that was designated as an air raid shelter, and until we had to wait for the all clear, and then everybody up to the train again. And this happened 3 times in a row, that we went up, down. Finally, the 3rd time, the train took off. There were my 3 brothers. My mother was our baby carriage. My sister was in the baby carriage. And so my older 2 brothers lifted the baby carriage up the stairs, and my mother would carry it from the back. And we were out on the street. My other brother and my younger, 2 years older brother and I were at the back of the baby carriage holding on to the handlebars, you know, where my mother was. And my older 2 brothers were at the front, lifting the carriage over debris. There was debris all over the place, walls. I remember seeing some dead bodies. It was, but we had to do it, you know, we had to go through there, but it was, you do what you have to do. So we went there trying to get to a train station. And when we got to the train station had been bombed. So it also was damaged. And so we couldn't go by train. There were 2 other members of the church who were with my mother. And we walked in the direction of where we had to go. And I remember that my mother also has this in a journal, but I remember that we had to cross a damaged bridge on the girders of the bridge in order to get to the other side of the tracks, you know, from where we were. And this brother helped us cross over that. He had to take the baby carriage over, he carried it, walking on this girder, and then he helped my brother and me to get over there. My older brother and my next older brother went by themselves, you know, balancing on this girder. My mother came behind us, and then we walked a long ways, and we finally, I thought we walked all the way to our normal train station. Because then I saw my dad. He had always had to be at the plant. He couldn't go with us. And I saw him in the distance. It's still, you know, you think after all these years, you know, you get over this, right? but sometimes the memories, you know, I was happy to see my dad, as you can imagine, and he was happy to see us. he didn't know what had happened. All he knew is that the air raids were going on, and he didn't know whether he would see his family again or whatever. You just don't know. Since we were occupying the area there, the bakery had to supply bread to the Russian soldiers. And they would come in the morning with a truck and load up that truck with loaves of bread. And we would watch. We were always hungry at that point, so we would watch. We secretly wished that maybe one of the loaves would drop down accidentally and we could have some of it. Well, there were a couple of soldiers, you know, that they threw the bread up to each other, and they caught the bread and then stacked it in the truck. And they saw us, you know, watching them, I think. But then a loaf of bread fell down to the ground from where they were. And looking back, I think this soldier saw how hungry we were and maybe dropped it accidentally, because he didn't do that. I think he did it accidentally. Anyway, we were just looking at the loaf of bread and waited, hopefully, that we were hoping that nobody would notice it. And it finally was filled up, and the soldiers got into the cab and drove away, and the bread was located just in front of one of the rear wheels, partly, and the wheel rolled over part of it. But there was still some, you know, about 2/3 of the loaf was okay. And the truck went around the bakery building, and as soon as it was out of sight, we went over there and grabbed the book and took it up to our mother.
From the war efforts, families were united and strengthened.
It was hard on kids, because maybe their brothers, their uncles, their aunts, their dads would be gone, and so many, you know, of course we know it didn't come back.
And my mother, she was very brave, a very brave woman, as you can imagine, you know, in this kind of atmosphere. To have 5 little children. My oldest brother was 9 at that time, or 10, and 9, 7, 5, and 4 or 5. My sister was 3.
But one thing that affected my youth until I was married and so forth was that my mother had been blind all her life. So we pretty well supported her a lot around the house anyway, but that made our upbringing a little bit different than most kids.
Didn't have a lot of money, so all of a sudden we're not having that money and not having the extras and all the things, because we never had that anyway. But we had family, and what, you know, I didn't know any different. We were just happy to be together as a family.
We heard that a food warehouse had been bombed, and so the women, you know, went, and a couple of the men went to and saw to see what we could get, you know, as food. And among those things was some sugar and cinnamon. So my birthday cake was a cup, a little cup, that in the bottom of the cup was some sugar and cinnamon, and we looked at our finger and put it in there and licked off the sugar and cinnamon, and the cup was being passed around between the 10 children. That was our birthday cake when I was 4 years old.
Communities came together to make life easier for everyone.
We lived in a community where everybody knew everybody, and we were very patriotic.
It was a time where the whole country was coming together in support of what was going on. 'Cause we knew that if we didn't win that war, even as a child, we knew that if we didn't win that war, that we were if we lost, it would have been nothing.
Maybe we weren't real friendly with somebody, but then they had casualty in their family because of the war. And then your heart softens, and that's what the Lord wants to happen, is that we care then, no matter what happened or what they did to you or what they said.
I think the war just made my town together, more sensitive to people and their problems.
I think we tried to pretend that we didn't need to worry because we were still all good neighbors. But then once in a while it would come up, and then it was a very serious answered question. Or did you hear from your son? Is everything okay? Or how's your brother doing? And then I remember others were anxious about turning 18 because that was the age that things would kind of change in your life. But it was always a serious conversation. And sometimes I think we were even afraid to even bring it up because it would hurt the heart.
I think everybody just was so willing to give. It was our freedom, you know.
I think there was more giving than there had been before.
Someone had extra, I think people were really good to ask, and if someone they knew, you know, would you mind loaning me some, I'm gonna bake, or so people were very helpful that way with each other.
Always, they had stars in the windows. Whenever a son or a husband was in the service, they had a white banner with a red star in the middle of it. If there were more than one son, they had more than one star, and if a son or a husband was killed, that banner was turned over, and you knew that there had been a death in the family.
There were flags that you put in the windows if someone did not make it, and a star on it.
People would have these little banners in the window that had a star on them that told if they had 1 or 2 or 3 sons, depending how many they had in the service. And then if one of them was killed, that would change color.
Gold star that you put in the window when you lost somebody. And Mother was always called a gold star mother.
How did the war affect you, even after it was over?
Made people a little bit more cautious and sensitive about the cost of war and what happens when you get into war. And the fact is that not everybody that goes off to war comes back.
Everybody was just all so excited. The city was just a big uproar. You could hear the noise like a 4th of July all at once, you know. It was exciting when the war ended because it had been going on for this, 41 to 45, almost 5 years, I guess. And that's a long time because in those days, the war was till it's over with. If you got drafted into the army and they were in a war, we hadn't had that too much up to that time, you know.
And she said, Susan, turn on our radio station and tell them there's a big announcement. And so she told me, and so I went and turned all the lights and everything on. And it was, the war is over. And I'm sorry, it brings back memories. And it was quite an experience, even though we're not supposed to do that. We were all just so excited in the class that we were jumping up and down. And to hear that information, to know that our family was safe now and the war was over.
You had a lot of military coming home, and so I think that jobs, I think it was a long time before things got where there were jobs and where the economy. During the war there was a lot of work because of the military, everything that was being produced for the military, so there was a lot of work. And so a lot of women went to work in those different factories or whatever it was. So they lost their jobs, of course, when the men came home because the men were going to be supporting families. So I think financially it was hard for a while.
Before the war, there was always a young man who would come out and wash your windshield and check your tires, check your oil, fill up your oil tank. And that was just the service that was given. But when the war came, then all of those young men went off to war. And so you had to do it yourself. So I remember right after the war ended, my brother and I were sitting in the back seat of our Ford, and a young man came out and washed our windshield and checked our oil and filled our tires and filled our gas. My brother says, The war must be over.
Before the Russians came in, there were refugees from the east, the East Prussia and so on. They were escaping from the Russians as the Russians advanced. There was day-longs, you know, horses with wagons and people walking and pushing carts, you know, just refugees from those eastern places that were coming into Berlin for refuge. And I learned later that many of them tried to stay in Berlin, but then they went further west, and those that went further west and crossed the Rhine River were actually fortunate because they ended up in West Germany, and those that stayed in the east ended up in East Germany, which was occupied by Russia, and they installed a communist government. I remember one time, we were there for 3 weeks, the war ended. May 8th, as I said, the Russians were in the city, coming into the city, just causing all kinds of problems as a victorious army would. You know, after all, the Germans, not the people in Germany, they didn't want war, but Hitler, he wanted war. And so the Russians were not very happy about, and were going to take advantage of the conquered Germans, you know, the enemies. We're not enemies, but they were. Anyway. So they were causing all kinds of problems in the city, especially women and young girls were always at risk. And one time, but there was no furniture left. Whatever furniture they could move, they threw it in the back of the house. There was the kind of a place where the clothing could be hung up to dry. And they broke it all up and damaged it, or burnt it, you know, just not to let us have it.
I wanted to go to Berlin, so part of Berlin is through the Russian-controlled territory at that time. So you went in at the border, you had your papers with. I remember going in, it was just a gray room. Pretty soon a little panel opened up in that wall, and a hand stuck out, and I gave them my papers, and the door shut, and I waited, and pretty soon the door opened up, the hand came out with the papers. I went on, so and then you saw Russian troops all along the road and then when I got to Berlin, I took a tour to East Berlin. That was quite a deal, because you couldn't go everywhere, and the Russians would come on the bus to see who was on there before you went over at the border. And when you went by these certain buildings, they were beautiful on the front, but the guide said behind them is nothing but rubble. So it's just a false sense of buildings there.
Do you think that communism is going to let people have freedom here in America if it ever happens? No. It's against everything that you feel. You know, there is no God, there is no Christ. Christians were suppressed, God was suppressed, praying was suppressed, and the only thing that's when you figure out that you are in a dictatorship, when you have to believe what the government tells you is true, you have to accept that as true. We have that kind of situation now. I was 11, my sister was 8, and we usually on Tuesdays went to primary, just the two of us, walking, taking a train. It took us about an hour and a half to get to primary, and we came back in the evening. My parents, they went to Mutual at night, and adults used to go to Mutual in those days, and they went in the evening, so everybody knew that that's where we went to church in West Berlin. And that day, we didn't come back. You couldn't take anything with you, so that you wouldn't be obviously a refugee. There were many people were fleeing the east. East Germany was depopulating, and that's why they built the wall finally in 1961. Until we were accepted as, and that was about 3 months. We were in refugee camps. A big place And once we were accepted, we were flown to West Germany and to a refugee camp in the south of Bavaria. And we were there for about 4 months. And then we were shipped to another refugee gathering place in West Germany, in the North Rhine-Westphalia area, Dortmund. And then we're assigned to a city. Each city had to accept so many refugees from these. And we were in a city called Schwerte. You know, thinking about the war, after my wife and I were married, this was, you know, I was 26, 27, going to the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And every once in a while, or even after that, we watched a TV show, you know. There were lots of war movies. I don't know how many war movies you've seen. But when I heard those sirens going off in the war movie, I would crawl over to my wife and yeah, she'd put her arm around me.
What are your thoughts about war?
I'm not a pacifist. You know, if I had been old enough, I would have jumped right in there. But, oh boy, I can't really, war is really national selfishness. Even if it's protecting you, to somebody is wanting to get something from somebody else. One country wants some resources, some natural resources. You know, that's like everywhere it's ever been. Is that they want to get part of their land because they think they need to have the resources of those land. But I don't think there's anything good about war. I just don't.
Yep.
My thoughts on war? They're terrible. And people should be able to work things out without war, but Satan wants war, and he gets people to war. You know, even look at today. I mean, how the warmongering and the wars that are going on, does it benefit anyone? No, not at all.
Sometimes you have to shed blood, and you don't like to do that. But it's for the cause of your country and the freedoms you enjoy. And freedom is not free. You have to sacrifice for that. And it was a shame that's what took place, but freedom is a wonderful gift that we have, and we have to protect it in any way that we can when that time comes for us to do that.
We don't strike first, but when our freedom is threatened or somebody, then yes, I agree with. It's a necessary thing if you want to be free.
Shouldn't have to happen, and then
If you can avoid it, I think you should avoid it for sure, but there may be some things where you basically don't have a choice, so you have to, you know, either stand up or else be pushed over by some other country. You know, for the most part, if it can be avoided, I'd say I'm against it, but I do have some feelings that maybe sometimes it's necessary.
I think all of us would say, why? Why can't we just accept each other and love each other? Why is there always that undercurrent? Well, even in families, we have wars sometimes. Not to that other degree, but and sometimes we become very selfish. Maybe more land, more country, more people, more products that they're producing, more of everything. We're not satisfied with what we have been blessed with. And so then we become very selfish. And power is more important than caring for others. And I think that's a word that is very evident even today, power. The more power you have, the more you have anything, everything, people included, then the happier. I guess that's greed.
But the emotional impact is still alive inside here.